Good morning. As MRAC designated federal officer, it is my pleasure to call this meeting to order. Before we begin this morning's panels, I would like to turn to Commissioner Sharon Bowen, the MRAC sponsor, for the welcome. Chairman Massad, Commissioner Giancarlo, and Commissioner Bowen will then give their opening remarks.
Good morning and welcome, everyone. I'm going to be really brief and turn it over to the chairman.
Well, thank you. Well, first, let me just express my appreciation to Commissioner Bowen and her staff and all the members of the Market Risk Advisory Committee for all the work that's gone into this meeting and for your presence here today. And let me also thank the rest of our staff, as well as the staff of the FDIC, who's here today with us. We really appreciate your involvement. And of course, I'm always pleased to be here with my fellow Commissioner Giancarlo as well. You know, the agenda for this meeting was set some time ago, needless to say, so we won't include any discussion of the UK vote to exit the European Union. But let me just say that the CFTC has been closely monitoring the markets that we regulate. And on Friday, as well as thus far today, they have functioned in an orderly manner, notwithstanding the volatility that has followed the vote. And we will continue to monitor these markets closely. We'll continue to work with the clearinghouses and the exchanges, as well as other regulators, to do all that we can to ensure that they continue to function properly. So turning to today's agenda, let me begin by saying that the advisory committee meetings that we have always provide a great opportunity for us as commissioners, as well as our staff, to hear from stakeholders about important developments and to get input on the many issues that we may be considering. And of course, we'll be benefiting from that input today. For example, we will hear more about the CCP Risk Management Subcommittee's draft recommendations to enhance coordination among clearinghouses and default management. Today's meeting will also serve another important purpose, which is that our staff, together with FDIC representatives, will provide all of you here, as well as the public generally, with an update on a number of the important efforts taking place regarding planning for resolution of Central Counterparties, or CCPs. It's my understanding that the FDIC will first provide an overview regarding resolution of globally systemic important banks, or GSIBs. And that's very relevant to resolution of CCPs for a few reasons, in particular because GSIBs often have affiliated clearing members, or they provide custodial or settlement bank services to CCPs, and therefore GSIB resolution has the potential to impact the resilience of our clearinghouses. And following that, FDIC and CFTC staff will discuss planning for the resolution of CCPs, and as you will hear, a lot of work has already gone on, and that's true at both the domestic and international levels. I believe we're going to hear about the international standards that were concerning resolution of CCPs that were developed some time ago by the FSB, as well as the relevant provisions of Dodd-Frank that pertain to this. We'll hear about the work of the FDIC together with the CFTC to develop resolution strategies in light of that legal framework and those standards. And I just want to note again my appreciation for the close and collaborative working relationship we have had with the FDIC on this. And you'll hear about the many ongoing work streams that are taking place both domestically and internationally, including the work done by the Cross-Border Crisis Management Group on this topic. I think we're going to touch on the distinctions between recovery and resolution planning. But unfortunately, beyond noting those distinctions, I don't think time will permit us to discuss all the work being done on recovery planning. Let me just say that our own staff has been extremely busy in this area as well, both in terms of developing strategies and standards, as well as working with our international colleagues to develop resolution strategies. And you might say that all this reflects the priority that the CFTC is placing on what I might term the 3 R's for CCPs, obviously not reading, writing, and arithmetic, but in this case, resilience, recovery, and resolution planning. Those things have been a priority of mine since taking office. They're a priority of regulators around the world, as evidenced by the agreement of international and U.S. regulators last year to implement a 4-part work plan to look at resilience standards, recovery and resolution planning, and interdependencies among clearinghouses and clearing members. And I'm pleased that we at the CFTC are leading much of this work. And these issues are top of mind, not just for us, not just for those in Europe, but also for people in Asia. I just returned from a trip out there, and I discussed these issues with regulators and market representatives in some detail. I spoke at a conference in Shanghai of a new organization called CCP 12, an organization of clearinghouses that many of the clearinghouses represented here today are involved in. So again, I think this is a very timely and productive meeting. I thank Commissioner Bowen and her staff for organizing it. I thank, again, the presenters, and I look forward to the discussion.
That's great.
Thank you, Chairman. Commissioner Bowen always has impeccable timing, but I don't think that she could have predicted the impeccable timing of having our Market Risk Advisory Committee take place today in the wake of what's happened in Europe over the last few days. And I think it shows the commitment of this commission as well as the CFTC staff to examining market risk and understanding it and looking for continued ways to mitigate its impact on market environments. It is a great privilege to be here today. I think you have all seen the commitment that the 3 commissioners make to our advisory committees and to the important matters that are discussed at that, and that continues through today's meeting. So with that, I just want to thank all of the participants for being here. None of these meetings happen without a lot of preparation and work in advance. I think sometimes just the meeting itself is only 1/10 of the work that goes into the preparation and getting ready for it. So it's with a lot of gratitude that we express to all of you as members for your work on these committees. And thank you. I look forward to a good hearing today.
Thank you. Welcome to the June 27, 2016 meeting of the Market Risk Advisory Committee. I'm excited to be the sponsor of this committee, which brings together a diverse group of market participants to discuss the important topics of systemic risk and the evolving structural changes in our derivatives markets. Before beginning our meeting today, I'd like to say a few words about the recent British referendum. In the next few months and even years, we as regulators will need to make many decisions in light of this new reality. In the days and weeks to come, the industry and others who observe these markets will have a better sense of what are the temporary versus the long-lasting effects. I believe that this committee, which is composed of industry, academicians, regulators, and public policy groups, will be a key source of advice and analysis to this committee. So now let us just turn to today's meeting. First, I'd like to thank the chairman and also Commissioner John Collar for being here today and for your support of the work of this committee. Second, I'd also like to thank the committee members, our guest speakers, and the commission staff for their work and participation in today's panel discussions. And last but not least, I'd like to thank the logistical staff, led ably by Margie and Antonio, who worked tirelessly behind the scenes to set the stage for these meetings. I have the bittersweet task of saying goodbye to some of our valued members while welcoming some new members to our committee. First, the members who have left the committee: Emily Portney, formerly of J.P. Morgan, Sunil Katuno of CME Group, Scott Flood of Citi, Robert Anderson of the Committee of Chief Risk Officers, Bill Hell of Cargill, and Lee Oleski of Tradewell. To Emil, Sunil, Scott, Robert, Bill, and Lee, thank you for your valuable contributions to the committee's dialogue and for your unique perspectives that you brought to the table on these important issues. You will definitely be missed. We are fortunate, however, to add new members to our committee who also bring valuable expertise and a diversity of perspectives. Thomas Cole, who's Vice President and General Manager of Chicago and Illinois River Marketing, who brings a vital perspective of agricultural end users. Scott Zucker, Chief Administrative Officer of TradeWeb, who brings the important perspective of swap execution facilities. Kim Taylor, President of Global Operations, Technology and Risk of the CME Group, who has had a long and well-regarded career in clearing. And Robert Steigerwald, Senior Policy Advisor of the Federal Reserve Bank of Chicago, who brings considerable expertise on a number of topics, including CCP recovery and resolution. Tom, Scott, Kim, and Robert, welcome to the committee. I'd also like to take the opportunity to thank Tom Clowett for his leadership of the CCP Risk Management Subcommittee, which we'll be presenting today. The draft recommendations that we will discuss today are largely due to Tom's efforts. Tom, while staying on the subcommittee, will be giving up his leadership role, and Susan O'Flynn, who's played a critical role in the efforts of the subcommittee so far, will be fully taking over the reins. So thank you, Tom and Susan. Today we will discuss three topics that are of critical importance to the market. How our CCPs can better coordinate their efforts to prepare for the default of a shared clearing member. How the FDIC, as the resolution authority, would address the resolution of a bank who is or is an affiliate of a clearing member. And three, how the FDIC staff, under the Title II framework, would work together in the unlikely event of a CCP resolution. Our first panel on CCP coordination is a continuation of a conversation that we started about a year ago. At our first MRAC meeting in April 2015, our CCP members presented their default plans, and the MRAC discussed the strengths and weaknesses of those plans. Out of that discussion arose two questions. How can the CCP's plans better reflect the likely market conditions during a default? Two, how can CCPs better coordinate their efforts to prevent and manage a participant default? At our November 2015 meeting, our CCP Risk Management Subcommittee led a discussion on the possible recommendations in response to the former question. And today, they will do the same in response to the latter question. I look very much forward to this conversation today. Just going to make this a little bit shorter. I'm also very pleased to have guests from the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, along with our staff, to discuss two very important issues of market stability: bank resolution and CCP resolution. In regard to bank resolution, in the case where the bank being considered for resolution is an affiliate of a clearing member, it's important that our two agencies work together to make sure that we do not duplicate or undermine our mutual efforts. Likewise, in preparation for CCP resolution, the FDIC, which is the resolution authority of CCPs, and our agency, which is the primary regulator of CCPs, would clearly have to work together. So I'm really eager to hear the viewpoints of both agencies today. I want to thank you all for joining us, and now we'll turn it over to our designated federal officer, Petal Walker, who will introduce our first facilitator and panel.
Thank you for your opening remarks. As noted in today's agenda, our first panel discussion will cover enhancing CCP coordination and default management, discussion of draft recommendations of the CCP Risk Management Subcommittee. I would like to introduce the facilitator for this first panel, Ms. Susan O'Flynn, Managing Director and Global Head of CCP Strategy, Governance, and Optimization for Morgan Stanley. Ms. O'Flynn has worked tirelessly in this subcommittee to produce recommendations on two occasions and has definitely thought deeply about these issues, and she will facilitate our first panel.
Okay, good morning, everyone. Thank you to Chairman Massad, Commissioners Bowen and Giancarlo, and of course Petal for your opening comments. As well, I'd just like to reiterate a welcome to the new members of the MRAC. Today, obviously, the first panel is on the recommendations on enhancing CCP coordination. of the CCP Risk Management Subcommittee, and as Commissioner Bowen said, this is in response to a number of the recommendations that were made in last November's meeting. I think you will find, as we, in today's session, that there is definitely some real coordination between, the sell, the buy, and side and the clearinghouses around this, what can be done with regards to CCP coordination. So I think, it's going to be a good demonstration of the partnership that has emerged through this process. So, with that, I'm going to turn over to a series of questions. On the board here, you'll see the actual recommendations here, 1 to 5, which our clearinghouse representatives will refer to. But without any further ado, I will move to the questions. So the first question, how can CCPs improve their communication with each other prior to and in the midst of a default that involves a shared clearing member? How can CCPs enhance their communication with the Commission prior to and during a default? With that, I'll just turn to Kim to begin.
I think the communication is a very important element of market stability. So in every crisis that I have been involved in over the many years that I have been involved in clearing, there has been naturally good communication within the industry, among the industry and the regulatory community, and even among the CCPs globally on certain aspects. But this recommendation of the working group came forward and suggested that we firm that up, specifically with respect to the default management process. The groups of people who would be running the auction process to liquidate the portfolios of the clearing members if there were a default situation. So we recommend that and have made some progress on creating a global directory of all of those parties and putting them in a process of routine contact, because when you're facing a crisis, actually it's good, you form good relationships in a crisis, but it's better to walk into the crisis with relationships already formed. So the recommendation here is that the default management branches of clearinghouses have ongoing communication in both peacetime and then have coordination in wartime.
Dennis, Kevin, would you like to comment any further?
I'll just make one comment. I think that it's not only CCPs who have to communicate between themselves, but also regulators who have to communicate between themselves and the various CCPs that are involved. So we can only go so far, but there is a role, I think, here that needs to be clarified, exactly what those communication channels would look like.
Hi, Susan. I have a couple thoughts. One, I want to follow up on something Kim said that's so important. Communication is based on good relationships. And I can tell you that we CCPs have good relationships. And we're regularly communicating. We sit on a lot of the same organizations together. Chairman Massad referenced the CCP 12. There's also the ASIC, Association of Systemically Important Clearinghouses. We sit on panels together, FI regularly, ISDA. We know each other well. The global directory will help. That's good, but we know each other. We know who to reach out to. You can imagine on Friday, we were talking to each other about the Brexit situation. So I just want to confirm, one of the questions up there is CCP should establish and maintain communications. We have good communication channels in place. We do communicate well.
Okay, thanks for that. Just there's a little bit of a volume issue, so if everyone can really speak into the microphone, I think that would be very helpful. And if any of the other subcommittee members want to ask a question, just turn your name tag vertical, please. Okay, second question. How can CCPs better coordinate the scheduling of traders who help with the default management process so that trading desks are not overtasked during a time of crisis?
With the advent of the over-the-counter clearing, it is CCPs need to use a different process to liquidate the portfolios than they typically would have used historically to liquidate very liquid futures positions. You can go to the market to liquidate those. You could auction them, but you don't have to. With the OTC products, you generally need to auction the products, and because the liquidity is certainly there, but it's less readily accessible to CCPs. There needs to be better coordination with traders in the market for purposes of hedging the portfolio and for purposes of running the auction process. What comes with that is the need for the bank clearing members, the clearing members who participate in these markets, to second a trader to the CCPs for default management purposes. And because there are multiple CCPs, and generally speaking, when we're in a situation like this, we would expect that there would be a default by the clearing member at multiple CCPs at the same time, there is the possibility for a drain on the resources of the system of the desks to provide traders. So the CCPs have determined that it is valuable to coordinate the rotation of clearing members serving on the various default management committees so that one desk won't be called to produce a trader for multiple CCPs at the same time if that is at all avoidable. And we think that that will help alleviate the default management process putting further strain on the markets at a time when there is already significant market stress and significant stress potentially at the bank clearing members who are providing these traders. As far as progress, CME and ICE have already started to work on the coordination of the rotation of the traders, and we expect that other clearinghouses will also join in that process.
Yeah, I think I agree with everything Kim says. I think the one thing it's important to note is that you don't need one trader for every bank on the default management committee of every CCP. The trader, once they, at least for LCH, once they're seconded onto the default management committee, no longer represent the bank. They act for LCH. We take the BlackBerry at the door, they've signed things, so they're acting for LCH. So the idea of having a critical mass of traders, one for every bank at every CCP during the default management crisis is not realistic anyway. So I think it can be narrowed down if we're very good at coordinating who's sitting on which committee.
So I agree that the coordination of the rotation will be a big help. But as Kim said, it really comes down to the clearing members' resources. It's their traders, as Dennis says, that they're seconding to us. They come to work for us. They have to sign paperwork that says that they're working for us and that they won't talk to their firms about the positions. One thought I have is when we started clearing the credit default swaps in 2009, we worked closely with our clearing members and our risk committee to establish the default management committee where you have these seconded traders. And the thinking was, as Kim pointed out, there's some discretion that needs to be exercised with respect to putting on the hedges. There was also a concern that the clearinghouse was new to the market and would need the expertise of the traders. Well, one, we've become more familiar with the market. We've been clearing CDS for 7 years now, and big volumes and open interest. And two, we have a process where on a daily basis, we're establishing what we call the first order hedges. So we're looking at the clearing members' positions, and we see what we need to do to hedge those positions if there's a default. So there's less need for the traders to help us with that. So maybe my point is, I think we continue to need the traders to help us, but maybe we don't need three. At ICE Clear Credit, we second 3 traders. Maybe we can work with our clearing members and our risk committees. Maybe it's 2. Maybe ultimately it's 1. But that might help the pressure with respect to resources too.
Just an observation as a clearing member who obviously has volume at all those 3 clearing houses. I think this is one of the key kind of heavily debated November recommendations around, clearinghouses coordinating to ensure that, no one firm is effectively sending two people to two different clearinghouses in the event of a clearing member default. I think there's also incumbent on the clearing members to have a centralised, kind of coordination effort internally to ensure that there is real kind of scrutiny as to what is being committed, and also understanding the bench that's being left behind to be able to manage and trade the house risk. So I think it's very much clearing members have really started to focus on this, and obviously it is very much a two-way process. So I think looking at where things were this time last year, I think there's been with coordinating rotation of traders and clearing houses and clearing members doing joint default fire drills like we saw in Europe in February, all of those processes help clearing members to be kind of more coordinated along and in partnership with the clearing houses.
And I would just add, as a follow-up to some of the points that Kevin was making, I think there are a number of things that can contribute to less need to rely on a large number of traders. One is, as Dennis mentioned, we don't need a trader from every firm on any of these default management committees. I think we might impanel 5 clearing members who might need to participate in any one default exercise. So that is a factor. Rotating the firms differently across the 3 of us or the multiple CCPs to reduce the duplication is one way, but also taking advantage of changes in the market, as Kevin said, or advances in the electronic trading and visibility and readily accessible liquidity that does not need to be accessed as much only through the dealer mechanisms will also help in that as the market changes over time. And if we get to a point where the liquidity is as visible and readily accessible in the size that is needed for the CCPs to liquidate that is available in the listed futures markets, then the reliance on a broad set of traders can be further reduced.
Okay, question 3. Can CCPs engage in regular joint default fire drills in order to better understand how their mutual markets interact during the default of shared clearing members? Kim?
This is a question that has been out there for a long time. I remember CCP default drills being done on a coordinated global basis back in the 90s. So from time to time, the CCPs do endeavor to drill together. Even if we haven't drilled together, we endeavor to coordinate in the time of crisis. I remember conversations during the Lehman situation between ICE, who was about to take over clearing, LCH, who was doing the clearing, and CME, who had newly taken over the NYMEX clearing, about whether or not there was something we could do on a coordinated basis with the energy portfolio of Lehman. So this coordination is a well-known goal of the CCPs to manage collectively the systemic risk that is facing the industry at a time of crisis is something that we're all very focused on. One of the best ways to make sure that that works well in practice is to practice doing it. And so there is a recommendation by the group that there would be simultaneous or joint default drills. There have been some examples of it, the example in Europe that Susan mentioned, and also CME has done coordinated default drills with individually a couple of CCPs ourselves as well. So there is a movement to start this process. The default management process really is the first part. I consider it part of resilience, but it also, if it fails, it can be the first step toward moving into the place where the CCPs need to use their recovery tools. And so it needs to be performed in a way that is set up to minimize the the process of needing to move from resilience into recovery and to maximize a good outcome. Drilling this jointly can only help in that regard.
I would agree with what Kim says. It's certainly good practice to try and coordinate logistically in terms of traders you're seconding, in terms of your approaches to the process. I think, though, there's a limit to what coordination really means in this context, because if there is a default, and we inherit the defaulter's portfolio, each CCP does, and it has to auction it off in the market to defease the risk. And it could well be that two CCPs are really trying to auction off a similar position. And under the way that we're structured, we have to follow our fiduciary responsibility, and we're in competition with each other. So there's a limit to how much the coordination could work. We can't show each other our portfolios, for example, because it would be great if we were on opposite sides of the market, because then we could cut out the bid-ask spread. We could cross the trades. But that may or may not be the case. We have no way of knowing a priori whether that's the case. So in actual fact, there may be a role here for a regulator to tap us on the shoulder and say, you should talk to each other in this particular example, because then we could actually save a lot of, if you like, money that we would waste in the auctioning process or in trying to defease the risk.
So fundamentally, practice is a really good thing. All of our clearinghouses at ICE, all the clearinghouses here today and elsewhere, regularly conduct very formal default drills. They're very structured. We have playbooks that are an inch thick, and it's good. I think ultimately we can get to a similar structure for cross-clearinghouse default drills, but it'll be involved. The good side of that is that it allows the clearing members and others to practice handling multiple clearinghouse default processes. But it's a project. I saw recently that FSOC issued its annual statement, and in its annual statement it has a section on clearinghouses. And what they've recommended is that the clearinghouses get together, both the public and private sector more broadly should get together, and in an informal setting, maybe similar to this, have a roundtable exercise, a tabletop exercise to get the input on the process and involvement in the process from a broader group.
Okay, question 4. How can CCPs better coordinate their auction processes so that market participants are prepared for auctions at various CCPs?
I think one of the takeaways that we all had and that we heard from the marketplace after the Lehman situation was that it would be good if the kind of input-output process of the auction was coordinated or standardized, so that everyone would, when bidders were receiving information from CCPs, they would be receiving it in a similar fashion. The auctions would be described and run under similar terms and conditions that everyone in the market would understand up front and not have a lot of questions and potential for confusion at the time of the auction. So the Default Management Working Group came up with a document. It's actually a fairly sizable document. It's on the table over at the side, and it is the Uniform CCP Terminology for Default Management Auctions. It lays out the descriptors associated with the auction process so that if clearinghouses agree to adhere to this type of format, and the bidding parties could actually prepare in advance to be in a position to understand the output that they're going to get from the CCPs in order to come up with their bids. Because there is not a lot of time that is allowed for in this process. And so we need the market participants who are going to be bidding to be able to understand and act very quickly once they have received the information from the CCPs. So this is, I believe that this document will go a long way toward avoiding the potential for confusion in the case of a default situation.
Yeah, I read the document. It's a good document. We agree with the gist of what's going on there. It's good to have standardized formats and templates to help the auction. I think, though, one of the things that we have to look at is why would an auction fail in the first place? This is only really lubricating that process. Are there structural issues which may lead to the failure of an auction? And we've done some work on that, and we have found that one of the biggest reasons for failure is that if you have a member who defaults and there's very few members on the other side of that market, so to speak, who have the opposite positions, then you're really exposed to the whim of one or two members bidding in the auction in the first place. So we think one thing that might be useful is to try and ensure that we monitor that situation so the markets don't become lopsided, and that can easily happen in the clearing space. So I think there's more to do. It's a good first step, but there's more to do.
So I agree that this Uniform Terminology Agreement is a really good document, and there was a lot of work that went into it. I think there were 8 clearinghouses that participated, and I think it's a good start. To be effective, though, I think it really needs to be incorporated into the respective clearinghouses' processes, and I think that'll happen over time. At ICE, we were in fortunately a unique position in that we're in the process of building out our automated default management system. And so we're using this document to build out and help with the specs of our automated default management system.
Okay. Question 5. Are there any other ways that CCPs can coordinate more effectively in order to mitigate the effect of a default of one or more significant clearing members?
You know, there are a lot of ways that CCPs can coordinate in times of crisis. And Dennis actually mentioned one of the areas that I think we'd love to see some ongoing and continuing improvement in terms of the communication would be between the regulators of the GSIBs and the CCPs, because there is a time period during which you can observe some deterioration usually, but in a lot of cases the primary supervisor has more information about that than other parties in the marketplace. And I know that there are concerns about sharing any of that information, but the more that the failure of multiple GSIBs is the realistically, the only thing that can potentially threaten the ongoing viability of the CCP mechanism. The CCP mechanisms are structured to withstand the default of X number of large clearing members. They're funded for 2. They're generally structured to cover the default of more than 2. But there is kind of by definition a process where the CCPs are not structured to necessarily withstand the default of, let's say, 5 or more large GSIB participants. So the more that the CCPs have coordination up front with the supervisors of the GSIBs, the better positioned CCPs will be to act in a default situation and to coordinate their actions in a default situation. One of the ways that we have discussed also working together is on coordination on the porting of customers. And there are certain things that can be done there. There is kind of pre-planning about who would be able to take on customers. There is also some standardization of tools and inputs and outputs that could be used by the CCPs that the market participants could benefit from. I think we've discussed whether we should include the porting of customers in the default drill process so that that is also an element that is practiced by the industry. But the one situation where the CCPs, I think, did work quite effectively together to transfer customers would be the MF Global situation. It was an unprecedented situation in the U.S. futures industry in that there was a default of a large clearing member with a shortfall in customer funds, and the CCPs were able to work together quite successfully to get the positions and a good part of the money, good portion of the funds, to the clients from a clearing member in bankruptcy very quickly. So I think that using that as an example, we would like to broaden the potential for coordination to include other types of product sets where because of, in a lot of cases, because of the regulatory capital implications, the porting of customers is somewhat more problematic and less attractive to the surviving clearing members than it used to be in the past. So I think this is an issue where the industry should need to work together to ensure that when there is a situation where customers need to be ported, all elements of the industry work together to kind of alleviate the potential for there to be a refusal to take customers because of the immediate severe capital impacts.
Yeah, in the porting of customers, it's becoming more and more problematic given the capital requirements some of these buy-side players can bring on to a member. So that the way is not very smooth. And we are talking about, for some of the large buy-side, we're talking hundreds of accounts that need to be ported in a matter of a day or two. It's very, very onerous, the actual process. So it would be useful if there were some alleviation of some of the, and I'm talking about temporary, of some of the requirements so we can onboard them and have some kind of holiday for a few days while we work through the process of meeting the Know Your Customer anti-money laundering protocols. Because after all, they would have been onboarded somewhere else, or they would have been working for some other, or part of some other member's portfolio in another CCP. So surely, inheriting that to another CCP should be much easier than if they were just off the street and nobody had a clue who they were. So the things that could be made easier here, apart from the process onboarding and technology-wise, are just physically moving accounts. Just there are some obstacles which could really prevent timely porting that I don't think are necessary, and they could be. We could have some kind of leeway for a few days or something to get those out of the way so we can complete the port and keep that client alive, so to speak, because after all, they were still paying margin. They're probably fine. The issue is with the member who defaulted. So I think keeping a client in a state of limbo for a while the defaulted member is being dealt with is a highly desirable outcome.
I thought porting would get some questions, so we have, I'm just going to go to Michael first. Sorry.
Thanks, Susan. So we heard at the start about the importance of resilience, and we've heard some very good things about the way the CCPs are working together. I think what I'd like to add as an observation to that is that, as Kim pointed out, it's likely that the membership of a defaulting member is going to be across multiple CCPs. And Dennis made an observation about the limitations of CCPs to be able to work together because of the directional risk and not knowing what each other have got. So what I'd like to think is that ahead of any default scenario, we as an industry had done as much as we could proactively, and Susan as a clearing member, what could we do with clearing members and CCPs and third-party providers together proactively ahead of a default, so that the default management process in normal markets, as we've discussed, good practice, how could we reduce risk ahead of that scenario, and even going into panel 2, where we're going to cover some of the improvements and actions of the regulators in a default. How do we see the regulatory view of proactive and reactive opportunities?
Cliff?
Just a general point that silence from our perspective implies consent. What my colleagues have been talking about, old friends have been talking about, the Eurex Eurex Clearinghouse is in complete agreement. Two points. First point is, one thing not to forget, and Susan, you're a good example of this, that there's a huge amount of bottom-up coordination that has resulted in huge improvements in the coordination prospects across different CCPs, and that's because the risk committees, in many cases, are made up of the same people. That's been a huge driver that's, I think, been honestly as important as what the regulators have been doing, is the people that have a lot of skin in the game are looking at this as you would hope they would, and said, hey, wait a minute, here are the things we really need to focus on. And these are, like I say, the guys on the firing line. Second point is, notwithstanding the chairman's admonition not to focus on the last couple days, let me just observe that the last couple days have been an excellent example of how the system is working and is much stronger, I believe, than before. Moreover, and this is an important general point with one recommendation, it also demonstrates the benefit of, pardon me for putting this in a way that sometimes is described negatively, but centralizing a lot of the risk, and certainly centralizing the processing of the tickets, has been hugely beneficial to the market. Now, you may have noticed that some banks have been quite proud at the number of tickets they've been able to process. That's in part because in the past, everyone's prayed for an event like this on a Friday, so people can beaver away on the weekend. That's one of the reasons why declaring a member in default on a Friday is so helpful in terms of porting members. The fact of the matter is, however, that the system, I'm not sure, could have operated successfully without this kind of centralized processing and, critically, recognition of losses, which in some ways was the catastrophic element on the AIG CDS mess, which was even worse because people were aware of it before it happened. It was a train wreck people were watching for years. I remember Alan Greenspan giving a speech about it 4 years before the crisis. The final point I'd make in that regard is a point which we aren't really talking about, which is how important getting the margining regimes right is in advance of the crisis. Because again, if you look at the actual experience before, over-margining of prospective at-risk members is as dangerous in some ways as under-margining. It's pro-cyclical, all sorts of problems on that. And my only observation is that as the clearinghouses are all making, how important the clearinghouse movement to portfolio margining is. Because only with portfolio margining are you really able to see, albeit at a CCP individual basis, what the total net risk position of a particular clearing member is. Portfolio margining is a huge part of trying to prevent a default, and it's a huge part of simplifying the default process. Now, obviously, different products need to be handled in an auction differently. You know, it's completely different, the rates complex from swaps, from CDS. But this portfolio margining gets the focus where it ought to be, which is the at-risk clearing member. Thank you.
Kristen.
Thanks, Susan. So thank you very much. I mean, we're certainly huge proponents of the work that's been done on the coordination side. Very important, obviously makes a difference. You know, I think from my perspective, thinking about last Friday, I think the markets function well in many different areas, including in this space. But I don't think that should give us a false sense of comfort about the risks that we actually do face. So remember that this event, while, you know, not expected to go in the direction that it did, we were extremely prepared as a market. So the way that we responded was in a highly coordinated way across buy and sell side firms, clearing firms, and everything went without a hitch. However, this type of environment, or that type of example doesn't happen very often. So usually we're faced with, very unexpected volatility in markets that happens quite episodically, large tail events, and no one is prepared. And so I think last Friday just made me consider the fact that while what we're doing is effective and it's in the right direction, I think we need to do more. And just referencing some of the comments that Kim made about kind of porting of customers during a default, it made me think about what kind of keeps me up at night based on what I've heard from this committee over the last year. And I think one of the things that I'd like to see us address in future sessions and have a broader discussion about is around the porting. So if memory serves me correct, I believe at least 3 clearing members of MRAC have talked, Morgan Stanley, Susan, correct me if I'm wrong, Goldman Sachs, as well as JP Morgan, have talked about their kind of grave concerns about the ability of some of the clearing members to be able to actually effectively port positions in the instance of default for a variety of reasons, but I believe, if recollection serves me correct, capital constraints and other issues that are affecting clearing members kind of post regulation after the financial crisis, which were quite warranted. So my concern, particularly given the fact that there is, there are a very small number of clearing members. They're basically clearing members on every single exchange or CCP around the world. And in the instance of a default, I'm very concerned that we're not, in practice, able to actually port positions, customers, and so on and so forth. So perhaps for a future meeting, but I think it's something that's important to have a dialogue about.
Gerald.
I think building on Kristen's comments, the other point here is and I think rightly so given the topic, we do focus in terms of the continual piece of how do you basically deal with the porting of positions in a default scenario, but with a number of these things, I think that it's also the fact of what you practice during normal market conditions can be a precursor to making sure we have an orderly functioning of the market during a stress condition. And I think we all realize that the actual porting of positions is time-intensive, manual, by appointment. If we can ultimately move toward having not just how we basically deal, I think it was, Kevin, to your comment on working on your automated default management, how we basically move that same type of automation into the normal daily process of porting positions, easily among different FCMs over time, such that we can make that process in a stress scenario, that much less of an impact into the marketplace.
And just a comment from me, and I think it ties back to what Michael said earlier, and the next panel, obviously, it's going to be critical to understand how a GSIB regulator and the CCP regulators coordinate around the process of default, and to understand as well, especially where it's a large clearing broker, how the sequencing will work, and what is actually happening to the clients of that defaulting clearing broker. Are they porting away, and who is left at that clearing broker, which in theory may or may not have another clearing broker. We need to. I think that's an open point that we continue kind of to debate, but we should hopefully touch on that in the next panel. And Kim, beg your pardon.
A couple of things in response to what Kristen was talking about porting. I think we mentioned it when we talked originally, but it's probably worth highlighting it. The way that the leverage ratio treats the margin of customers is not good in peacetime, but it is a killer in wartime. The very best, most creditworthy set of clients tend to be also highly directional, and therefore their positions generate a decent amount of margin. And those customers will need to be able to port, and it will become very difficult. Capital will be scarce at this time, and taking a double hit for taking the exposure of the client and taking a hit for the margin that you hold when honestly that margin nets out and covers the risk is going to be problematic. And one of the things that has happened over time when there were crises in the futures industry, which is when most of the problems happened before at least the U.S. CCPs were clearing a lot of over-the-counter products. The CFTC was always very thoughtful and reasonable and very good crisis managers themselves in terms of not making things worse by being kind of draconian about the letter of the rules. The Sentinel example would be a good example when some funds were tied up, or the reserve fund would be another good example. When some of those funds were tied up, the Commission did not assume that the value went to zero and increased the capital requirement by the full amount. They did a haircut and kind of phased in people's ability to re-up their capital. Now that the CCP's members are much more heavily regulated by or constrained by the regulations that apply to them in other markets than just the markets that the CFTC is the primary supervisor for, I think there's a risk that that same kind of cooler head might not prevail in the same way that it has historically. So that's something that I think it would be good if the regulatory community were able to work through in advance. That would make it easier for it to happen in a crisis.
Marcus.
Just on this leverage ratio issue, I mean, I think there is a basic kind of common sense thing where the more solvent and the more well-capitalized clearing members are going into a crisis situation, the more room we're going to have to manage that crisis by potentially easing up on those rules on a temporary basis during the crisis situation. And I take the point that there's a crisis management coordination issue with the banking regulators and with the Federal Reserve, but I just find it hard to believe that those regulators are going to be saying over a couple weeks period, over a month period, we're not willing to work with these capital rules in an emergency situation like the failure of a clearinghouse. And I think advanced coordination on what happens during that situation could be a good idea, but fundamentally, I think that the more solvent clearing members are going into that situation, the stronger a position we're going to be in.
Kim. Your car. Oh. Okay. Question 6, and we've probably addressed a number of these, but we'll just go through it. Are there any operational, legal, logistical, or other barriers to CCP coordination? And if so, can they be overcome?
I actually do think that we've talked kind of in general about a lot of those, although I will say that I think there probably is a difference of opinion among CCPs, and maybe it's a jurisdictional thing, because I think in CME's view, we have an MOU with the various global CCPs, and we feel comfortable that we would have the ability to share in a time of crisis management information, enough information about the positions and exposures that we are facing to be able to identify whether there's an opportunity to work with another CCP to kind of net those off or coordinate the liquidation of those positions. Because as Dennis mentioned, it would be beneficial to the marketplace for the CCPs to be able to avoid going to the open market for positions that actually are offsetting. But as they say, it takes two to tango. And so if only one CCP in the mix is comfortable sharing the information, then it will be more difficult to coordinate a kind of a consolidated or a cooperative liquidation of positions as opposed to running two separate auctions. So maybe what we need to do is make sure that in various jurisdictions there is protection for the CCPs to be able to share the information in a crisis management if that is necessary beyond what is provided in the MOUs.
Yeah, I think this is I keep coming back to that point, but I think there's a role here for the CFTC to help us over this obstacle that we have, because the CFTC obviously would know the relative positions inside each CCP and would be able to tell us whether or not we should talk or not. So it's just an idea.
So I agree with Kim generally that we're in a position to coordinate, but as Dennis alluded to earlier, we have to be careful when we get to the more specific areas of coordination, for example, coordinating an auction. It's important to remember we have different rules, different regulators, different regulations, different laws. We're in different jurisdictions. There are different bankruptcy regimes. So to get to the ultimate goal of having a coordinated auction of the defaulting clearing members' positions across clearinghouses around the world that are in different time zones, let alone different jurisdictions, it's a long road to hoe, and it's going to be quite a process, and we're going to need the cooperation of the regulators and the lawmakers and our clearing members and the market participants. It's a big deal.
And I agree with that, and I wasn't necessarily advocating one big coordinated auction. I was advocating circumstances where I think there would be pieces of portfolios where you would be able to identify that you had opposite sides and close those out without, and then auction a smaller portfolio on an individual basis. Because I do agree, one big auction would be very highly unachievable. I do want to say one other thing, though, about places where I think the continued focus on improving the way the process works is important. And one of those is the fact that CCPs are and have proven over time to be excellent at resilience and excellent at what we're now calling recovery, which we called default management before. So and you know, there's been good regulation and good legal basis for CCPs over time, but there's also been good behavior by the CCPs in understanding risk management, in understanding the systemic role that they play in the marketplace, and in understanding the importance of promptness and clarity and preserving value in the way that the default management situations have been run. One of the things that I'm concerned about in the current environment is that there seems to be a buildup of a desire for resolution to happen sooner in the process. And I think the CCPs have proven over time that they're really good at recovery, and I think the policy goal, the market's goal, should be that the CCPs recover. And so I have a concern that we're going to end up in a world where resolution is going to be tempted to preempt recovery, and I think we should be aware of that and try to guard against that across the system so that the CCPs have the ability to use their recovery tools and get back to a state where, remain in a state where they are functioning in their role in the marketplace. The other thing that I have some concerns about the way that the recovery and resolution process, the kind of global discussion is taking form, is that there seems to be a goal of having the plans laid out to the nth degree. We're going to do this then, and then we're going to do this, and we're going to do this, and we're going to do this. And the thing that has also been true of every crisis that we have faced is that they have all presented slightly differently. It's going to be very difficult to come up with a plan that is going to be the best optimization of actions and timelines for every situation that you might face. I agree with the policy objective of having the whole process be kind of better thought out and better documented in advance. So the idea of having plans that lay out what the tools are, I think that's a really good idea. I'm cautious about the fact that because if a CCP puts in its rules, I mean, especially in the UK as an example, if they have rules about default management and they follow those rules, they have a safe harbor from the insolvency process. And if they have rules and they don't follow their rules, they don't have a safe harbor. So the less flexibility they have to act according to the circumstances, I think we could face a situation where we potentially impair the outcome. So I would encourage the industry to think about these plans as toolkits rather than step-by-step enumerations of the exact order of actions that will occur, because you need some flexibility to respond to the situation that you're facing.
Kevin or Dennis, any comments? Okay. Kristen.
So I think that Kim's comments are very helpful. I think it's important to balance what she's saying. I mean, certainly, we think about the 3 R's: resilience, recovery, and resolution, kind of in that order. And we've been mostly talking about resiliency in this forum and what to do. I do think that, as I've stated before, while the goal is always recovery, there does come a point where resolution is necessary. And I think that we've talked about when the default waterfall has actually been eliminated, that's a trigger point from our perspective when resolution should happen, and it should happen very quickly to protect. Our view is that as soon as point of non-viability has occurred, the best chance of eliminating positions through the auction process is when you're as close to being kind of net as possible. So I would just reiterate what I've said on behalf of BlackRock in the past, is that while it's not a preference and recovery is the preference, similar to banks, which do follow a very structured step-by-step process administered by the FDIC when recovery is no longer possible, and banks do get resolved very successfully. My strong view is that a similar process that should follow a highly structured approach should exist and be followed for CCPs as necessary. And, from our perspective, the ultimate reason is that once the default waterfall has been eliminated, the remaining capital is essentially client margin. And we've talked about the fact that, at least in my view, and I think the view of Angela and 30 large other asset managers, is that under no circumstances should non-defaulting client margin, VM or IM, we've talked about the fact that IM is not allowed under CFTC regulations, but certainly the use of variation margin should not be an option to continuing along the path of recovery. And, just to clarify, I agree with what Kim has stated, and I do think that recovery is first and foremost, but I just want, to talk the other side of that argument, because I think it's important, particularly when you hit non-viability.
Can I just clarify that, Angela? You're saying variation margin gains haircutting should not be an option in the recovery phase, but rather should be reserved for the resolution phase?
Variation margin should never be used, period, because it doesn't belong, it belongs to non-defaulting clients. So I think what we've said, it's, I don't say this curtly, but it's, essentially, non-defaulting clients are taxpayers. They're not, and they're not willingly or knowingly putting their money at risk. They're under the impression that it's collateral that will be returned to them. So I don't think, as I've stated before, I don't think variation margin belongs anywhere in any default waterfall, nor should it be used in any part of default, which is why I think from a buy-side perspective, we've argued so consistently about robust margin methodologies, stress testing that's similar to what's done on the banking side in CCAR. And I think what we've said, the one exception is in the context of an auction, if there is the need to use variation margin gains haircutting over a 24-hour period to try to stabilize and close out all the positions, that is the only circumstance under which we would not vehemently, we don't like, but we would not vehemently oppose.
Yeah, I just think that severely limits, as I understand it, that would severely limit the options we have for trying to get back to a matched book in a circumstances where obviously we have exhausted the waterfall otherwise. And I recognize that all account holders are taxpayers, but we're also trying to come up with plans that don't use taxpayer money per se, which is obviously a much broader set of people than those who participate in the futures market.
Right. So in that context, what I think is that CCPs are by and large, with some exceptions, for-profit entities that benefit from the clearing mandate. So clearing members participate. There's a cost of clearing. It's increasing. I think the best approach forward is to have as much transparency as possible, even if it means increasing fees to end users. We would much prefer to give our end user clients in our fiduciary accounts, the option to continue using products at a higher cost. I'm obviously not a proponent of higher costs, but it does look like what's happening with capital requirements, markets in general, the cost of clearing is going up, but we still have to have sufficient loss-absorbing capacity in the instance of default. So I think it should come from, very robust margin methodologies that determine exactly how much margin is needed up front, even if it costs more money to any users of the products, especially our clients, and larger amounts of capital put aside by the CCPs themselves. So we've talked about amounts at least as large as the largest clearing member, so in the 8 to 12% range, but not using non-defaulting margin of clients.
Michael.
I just want to revisit the piece before about the ability for CCPs to coordinate in the auction, and again, how much of that can be done in advance where the clearing members are able to focus in a default scenario on serving their clients, and how much of the bulk of the risk, which we know overall might be relatively neutral, but is likely to be directional at a given cleared venue or bilaterally, and that risk could be substantially reduced in advance of any auction process.
Kim.
I was wanting to weigh in a little bit on the topic of the variation margin gains haircutting, which I also am a believer in the sanctity of client money. So I think CME is not in favor of certainly initial margin haircutting. And I agree, it's not really allowed in the U.S. jurisdiction anyway. But on the topic of variation margin gains haircutting, I think what I would say is that when you're talking about the kind of tail end of recovery of a CCP, or then later than that, if you hop over into the resolution phase of a CCP, I think we really are talking about the tail of the tail of the tail. And not that we shouldn't plan for the almost unthinkable to happen, because we should, but what has to happen in order for a CCP to get even into the place where they would be using the default fund has got to be something that is far worse than the crisis of 2008, because no CCPs used anything but the margin of the defaulting firms in order to satisfy that situation. So what has happened, if we are at this point, is that there has been a total failure of the bank supervision regime, and a big economic hit, like economic policy has failed in some significant way, right? It is a case of kind of global economic and financial chaos. And so under the circumstances where you're way out in the tail, you need to make choices about what is an appropriate way to kind of cost benefit analyze that. And so I think that's why we got to a point where, for purposes of the kind of end of recovery, variation margin gains haircutting seemed like it was an appropriate thing to do, mostly because it provides everything we're trying to do in default management and in the recovery process is designed to try and incent the proper behavior of the remaining clearing members to participate in the default management process. And so by having their gains haircutted, it puts them in a position where, obviously, if other clearing members are gaining on these positions, it's likely that the defaulting firm is losing on these positions. And so it sets up a dynamic which makes the losing positions of the defaulter more attractive. It increases the alignment of interests, we think, in the auction process. So that is why we ended up getting there at the, in the tail of the tail of the tail.
Yeah, I think I definitely understand where you're coming from and the logic behind it. And I think potentially, other, buy-side participants or others could get comfortable. I think the issue that is difficult is that we don't have good transparency into the adequacy of loss absorbing capacity. So I think, the quantitative disclosures, the numbers that actually started, coming out as a result of that, that's very helpful. But it's just a number, and we don't have details into the underlying margin methodologies, the stress testing that was done. So I think in order to think about what you do in the tail of the tail, we would have to have good understanding with transparency and disclosure around how the loss absorbing capacity was actually calculated, and particularly how it changes in wartime, which is, and I believe the FSB or some of the other international regulators have begun talking about standardized regulatory overseen stress tests for CCPs for precisely that reason. So if the capital pool is sufficient, I understand where you're coming from, and no one's going to argue with a tail of a tail type of scenario. It's just that I think the loss absorbing capacity, at least on the other side of the table, is not clearly known at present.
Kevin?
I just want to follow on quickly to what Kim was talking about, especially since we're in a public forum here. It's really important to understand the clearinghouse's risk management practices. And as Kim says, what we're talking about is the tail of the tail of the tail. So obviously we have our margin standards, but with respect to the default resources, we're at a minimum of cover 2, meaning we have to cover the 2 largest defaults of our clearing members. And we're talking about some of the world's largest financial institutions. And that cover 2 standard is without assessments. When you throw in assessment rights, we're really covering 4, 5, maybe 6 of the world's largest financial institutions defaulting to us. And Kristen, to your point, traditionally, the clearinghouse's default process, our rule book structure was when we got to the end of the waterfall, we'd wind down. But now, and rightfully so, since we're systemically important, there's more and more focus on what happens next. And in fact, we're required by regulation to deal with uncovered losses. When we get to the end of the waterfall, what do? How do we address the uncovered losses? And really, we don't like variation margin gains haircutting. It's an ugly tool. But it's really, we've thought about this a long time. We've worked with the clearing members. We've worked with the regulators. It's really the only solution. Now, I was in London, and I won't name the regulator, international regulator, made a suggestion that I think makes sense, and it ties into what we're about to discuss with respect to resolution. You know, maybe we can build into our rule books that the resolution authority has, because we're worried about their tools. And I agree with Kim that we need to allow the clearinghouse rule book to apply before the resolution authority steps in. We need that ex ante, before the event certainty for the marketplace, for our clearing members. It's very important. But one possible solution might be to give the resolution authority, we could bake this into our rule books, the right to step in at the end of the waterfall and to make one more final assessment. Maybe the assessment's limited to the amount of the guarantee contribution, but then the resolution authority would be in a position to make the determination, working with the regulators, as to whether there would be an unattractive systemic impact to variation margin gains haircutting. I'm glad you referenced the public quantitative disclosures. We do believe that those give you your answers. And I want you also, hopefully, and others that don't have the transparency that our risk committee, our clearing members, and the regulators that they see, to understand that they are watching us closely. We have our risk committees. We have the regulators looking at our margin practices, our guarantee fund practices, our default practices. All of this is highly scrutinized, not just by one regulator, the CFTC, who sits here today, but the SEC, the Fed, the Bank of England. There's a whole host of regulators overseeing our clearinghouses.
Okay, Marcus, I think you're going to be our last speaker before we quickly wrap up.
Thanks. I just wanted to follow up on something Kristen said and maybe summarize my understanding of what she said. That Kristen, you felt that you would be willing to pay more up front, or you felt your customers would be willing to pay more up front for more assured loss absorbency capacity rather than risk variation haircutting?
So apologies. So what I was attempting to say is that what we would like to do, is give our clients the ability to choose. Mm-hmm. So right now, from a fiduciary capacity, our clients believe that their margin is recoverable unless there's an actual default that involves them. However, that's not necessarily true in the instance that variation margin haircutting is done. So what I think would be preferable, if the cost of clearing is indeed going up, I do think that there are signs across many different institutions that it is going up and might continue to go up for a variety of reasons that we've talked about before. If that's true, we would like to disclose to our clients and give them the option of, do they want to pay the additional costs and continue using cleared products? Do they want to remove hedges? Do they want to use other financial instruments, cash instruments? So as a fiduciary, our role is to give as much information as possible to our clients and let them make the decision about their investment decisions.
But as a fiduciary, you feel like it might be in your client's best interests to pay a higher cost of clearing in order to avoid a situation where unpredictably their margin could be at risk?
I think it's very important for all participants in centrally cleared activities to understand the true cost of clearing, the cost of default, and the adequacy of loss absorbing capacity in peace and war times. Mm-hmm. And I think the quantitative disclosures are a step in the right direction, but there's certainly a very small step if you think about what regulated banks report around their risk management activities. So I'm a proponent in more information so that all participants can make better decisions. And I do feel as a fiduciary that we are currently impaired when it comes to doing due diligence on CCPs. So we don't, the CCPs have been, very helpful, lots of dialogue. It's just the level and detail of information that we receive from CCPs versus our OTC bank counterparts is very different. And we would like it to be at the same level as bank counterparties. in bilateral transactions.
Just conscious of time, and quickly wrap up, and I think it brings a natural end to this discussion, which certainly got more lively as we went on. Question 7. What role, if any, should the Commission play in encouraging greater coordination amongst CCPs in the default management process?
Here again, I think that we've covered some instances of this. Dennis had mentioned a couple of cases with the Commission helping to facilitate CCP information sharing. And I think we also mentioned instances where we think it will be important for the CFTC to work with banking supervisors, for example, about information sharing including CCPs when there is, it would be good for CCPs to know in advance of GSIB being shut down that was coming in order for us to help plan. And I recognize in saying that the kind of public policy stance around the safety of the bank information. So I fully realize what I'm saying, but I think that CCPs are kind of part of the financial system fabric in a very important way. And I also think there is an important role for the CFTC and other kind of frontline supervisors of CCPs to help ensure that that resolution doesn't preempt recovery. I do think that there is a need for the supervisors to kind of who understand the best the ways in which resiliency and recovery will work to help ensure that there is an opportunity that is preserved for those things to occur and and work before there is a preemptive action taken by the resolution authorities, because I think the entry of the resolution authorities at the appropriate time, I think, is appropriate. The entry of the resolution authorities ahead of the time when it's time for resolution probably is actually a market destabilizing event.
Dennis?
Yeah, just in addition to what Kim said, I think the porting puzzle is probably the biggest conundrum, one of the biggest conundrums we face, and any help from the Commission in dealing with that would be gratefully received. In particular, things like facilitating a process from a client who is in good shape, paying margins, everything is fine, but they just happen to be a client of a member who's in default. It's not the client's fault. How to find a home for that client. We can't really do it by ourselves. We can do it to some extent, but we really need help on that.
Kevin?
I'll just say quickly at a very high level that this committee and this process answers that question: what role can the CFTC play? This is a really good process. What you see today is the MRAC, but underneath it, I have to look at my chart because it gets complicated. We have the CCP Risk Management Subcommittee that's been discussing all these issues. Below that, we have the CCP Coordination Subcommittee. And then below that, we've had the CCP Working Group that's made up informally of all of our clearinghouses here and the staff representatives. So there's been really good discussion. We really do, from a clearinghouse perspective, welcome these discussions. We believe in transparency. And so I think this has been a really good process. Thank you.
Clifford?
Other than not worrying so much about the Paisley-Swan event, I would urge two very specific items where I think the Commission can do a lot of work. And we've talked about one, which is portability. But in particular, I think the only realistic solution for a big clearing member to default is consistent with your acceptance of gross margining, which, by the way, as you know, Mr. Chairman, is not what my friends in Frankfurt do, but they agree that's the right way to do it. But gross margining makes sense if you actually could have an interim step where realistically the clearinghouse is going to have to hold customer margins for some period of time. So you can't get this done in a day. So even on a Friday, I think for a JP Morgan or a Goldman going toes up, it would take longer. And I think that's something that you guys, there are various things, specific things that you guys can fix. Related to that, and a point that has been made by Chris and others, is I'm surprised nobody's focused on trying to fix the U.S. bankruptcy provision, which we all know about and don't like to talk about. I know it's really hard, and I understand that the different committees on the Hill and whatnot, but I just think as you have highlighted issues like the unintended consequences of SLR and other things, I think just getting this out, because I know that in the 30 years I've been involved in the industry, I was always very casual about saying customer funds are not at risk, period. And we only recently discovered that actually bankruptcy judges may have a different view about that. And I think there are legal ways, you guys know this better than me being smart lawyers, at least highlight it. Maybe there are interim fixes like tri-party custody and margin money as a choice that costs more to the customer if they want to pay a little bit more to try to make it harder for the bankruptcy judge to get at it. But it may not work. I don't want to practice law without a license. I'm cognizant of Mark Twain's comment about people that represent themselves.
Okay, so, pardon.
Cliff, to that point, I'm not quite sure I understood the point, but so maybe afterward we can follow up on that. But let me just say a couple of quick things. First, thanks everyone. I thought it was a very good discussion. And to Kim's point, some of the others have, I think, referred to it about resolution not preempting recovery. I think that's a very good point, and I guess I would also phrase it maybe slightly differently, which is that resolution planning should not create incentives that undermine recovery. Meaning that as we think about these things, we have to plan for both. We have to go through the recovery planning, we have to go through the resolution planning. Obviously, we hope that we never get to either of them. But I think it's very important as we work through these issues that we don't create potential incentives in the way we think about resolution that might, for example, give participants that might cause participants to have less incentive to participate in an auction, for example, because they think they might get a better deal in resolution. And there are other ways that this can play out also. So I think that there is a tension, or there is a relationship between these two things that we have to very much keep in mind. I think the FDIC in our discussions has also been quite aware of this dynamic. Finally, let me just apologize to Kristen. I think I misspoke when I first referred. I called you by a different name. So I think I called you Angela because you're sitting next to one another.
I didn't even notice, so no apologies necessary.
Okay, well, I just want to say thank you to everyone on the committee today for your contribution and at times lively debate. And I'll hand back to Petal if you've any more comments.
Okay. So thank you, Susan, for facilitating that panel. We will be starting again in about 10 minutes, about 11:45. This will be our only break for the morning. I'm sorry, yeah, that's right. The only break for the morning, so just keep that in mind. Our panels 2 and 3 will go right into each other. Thank you. Starting in 1 minute. It is my pleasure to call this meeting back to order. As noted in today's agenda, our second and third panel discussions, respectively, will cover FDIC staff presentation on GSIB resolution, and then CFTC and FDIC staff presentation on CCP resolution. I would like to introduce the facilitator for our second and third panels, Mr. Robert Steigerwald, who is the Senior Policy Advisor and Senior Policy Advisor for Financial Markets at the Federal Reserve Bank of Chicago. Robert needs no introduction to this community, given his extensive work and deep thought on these matters. Thank you, Robert. I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Petal. That was very kind of you. Thank you for that introduction, and thank you to Commissioner Bowen for asking me to be a part of this committee, and to Chairman Massad for welcoming me here. I'm quite honored to be a part of this committee, and I'm going to try to set a good example for the panelists on the next two sessions by speaking loudly and clearly into my microphone. Hopefully that will help the folks in the back of the room and those who are listening in remotely. Well, Petal, you've put me to work right away in my first meeting, and so that's the best way, I think, to learn the workings of this committee. I'm happy to facilitate this panel. Let me briefly introduce the speakers in the next two panels. Mr. Jeff Banman, Acting Director of the Division of Clearing and Risk at the CFTC. Robert Wasserman, Chief Counsel in the Division of Clearing and Risk. Herbert Held, Deputy Director, Systemic Resolution Planning and Implementation Group at the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation. R. Penfield Stark, Assistant General Counsel in the Receivership Section at the FDIC. And Charlton Templeton, the Chief of Resolution Planning at FDIC. That's the hardest work that I have been assigned for purposes of these two panels. The speakers have arranged a sequence for their presentations, and I will now hand the discussion over to them to carry on this panel.
Okay, thank you. I'd like to start and say that since the enactment of Dodd-Frank, the FDIC has been working very closely with the Federal Reserve Board to make sure that the firms are in a position where they can fail under the bankruptcy code, our whole process of the living wills, and that is the preferred strategy for the resolution of a global SIFI under the Dodd-Frank regime. Title II of Dodd-Frank, which is the Orderly Liquidation Authority, provides a backup to that in case that liquidation under the bankruptcy code would not facilitate an orderly resolution. And under Title II, our main goals are to minimize the systemic risk of the failure, make sure that the costs of the failure are borne by the owners, creditors, and if necessary, the financial industry, and not the U.S. taxpayers, and that culpable management is removed. Title II gives the FDIC many of the same powers over SIFIs that we have long exercised in managing failed bank receiverships. And the FDIC has a very long history of managing thousands of failures of banks without disrupting providing systemic effect on the economy. Under Dodd-Frank, we have a pretty complicated looking process for invoking our authority. The Fed and the FDIC, 2/3 of their boards have to vote for making a recommendation to the Secretary of Treasury. In cases where the main subsidiary is a broker-dealer, the SEC is the key turner rather than the FDIC. And for insurance companies, the Federal Insurance Office is the key turner rather than the FDIC. For all non-insurance company, non-banks, the FDIC would be the key turner. And for any institution where the bank is the largest operating sub, the FDIC would be the key turner. Once the recommendations are made, the Secretary of Treasury makes the determination after consulting with the President. Financial companies are offered a judicial hearing to be held within 24 hours after the determination, unless they acquiesce to the appointment. And only after that hearing can the FDIC be appointed receiver. Next, yeah. This schematic is a lot scarier than I think reality. It shows the process for appointment and the various parties that are involved. And this is not very different from the systemic determinations that we had to make back in 2008 and 2009 when systemic determinations were made on the bank level for the FDIC to do resolutions of some of the largest banks. The process is complicated in that it has lots of players. They have to make recommendations, and their boards have to have vote with a supermajority. The reality is that in a crisis, these recommendations were made quickly, and the Secretary of Treasury acted quickly, and the agencies were very coordinated in their response to the crisis. We have worked closely with all the agencies involved in planning for this three keys process, knowing what each agency's role is, what the recommendations that have to be made and who would make them, and what information would the Secretary of Treasury would need.
Okay, we're going to talk a little bit about the powers that are available to the FDIC as receiver for a GSIB. As Herb mentioned before, and it's noted at the top of the slide, the powers, the statute makes Title II is very similar to the powers in the FDIA for banks. We'll talk later about CCP resolutions, but even with a GSIB resolution, even though the statute looks the same, the process is going to be somewhat different because the facts will be so different. But in any case, the first sub-bullet notes that the receiver stands effectively, as we say, stands in the shoes of the failed company, and succeeds to all the rights, titles, powers, and privileges. Covered financial company is the term used in Dodd-Frank for the company that had failed. As we do for smaller banks now, we have the ability to have a bridge financial company so that the company can fail and yet its operations can be maintained in an ongoing entity. The bridge company is chartered by the FDIC, so that's the change. Says we've been around since 1934, but have never chartered a bank or a company until now, and would unlikely do so in a GSIB resolution. We have the power to transfer assets and liabilities without obtaining consent. Obviously, it's critical that the transfer be made at the moment that the receiver, the FDIC, is appointed as receiver. So that will override contractual as well as statutory limits on transfers. For claims that are not transferred to the third party, including the bridge, they would remain behind. The FDIC runs an administrative claims process in the receivership and typically provides receiver certificates to other than administrative claims. In the event that the claimant doesn't agree with the FDIC's determination, it's free to go to court as long as it does so within 60 days. And it can pursue the claim in court on a de novo basis. The record created by the FDIC in denying the claim won't be relevant. One of the thoughts in working on Title II is that there be some that the FDIC put together a proposal, a process where claimants who are turned down might have the ability to settle rather than having to go to federal court and be engaged in litigation for a significant period of time. We talked about transferring assets and liabilities in general. Specifically, there is the ability to transfer QFCs. Qualified financial contracts are generally derivatives as well as repos and securities lending transactions. So as long as those contracts are transferred within one business day of the failure, any rights to terminate in the contracts would be overridden for that day, and to the extent it's transferred to another financial institution, including the bridge, that termination rights would be overridden in their entirety. And then finally, there is a 90-day stay against termination of non-QFC contracts. In fact, even those that have defaulted prior to the FDIC being appointed as receiver, the FDIC can maintain those contracts if it needs them in the short term. So moving on. So we're going to focus just for a second on the accountability aspect of Dodd-Frank. Obviously, with the significant failures, there was a concern in the last crisis for the lack of accountability to managers of failed companies. As Herb noted, this accountability is one of the major tenets of Title II, along with financial stability and mitigating moral hazard. This responsibility has been a significant focus. Obviously, officers and directors can be or must be removed. As officers and directors of failed company, they effectively are removed from that company by the receiver taking their authority. They can also be removed from being in the financial industry in general going forward. There's an additional provision that executives who were substantially responsible for the failure can have their salaries for the prior 2 years before failure clawed back and put in the receivership estate to help pay creditors. And finally, there is a priority of payments scheme, as in any insolvency regime. In Title II, it looks very much like the bankruptcy scheme, with one major difference. Rather than all wage earners being given a priority, all wage earners except for senior executives and directors are subordinated. In fact, they're paid after subordinated debt holders are paid in full. So effectively, they would be recover immediately before equity to try and limit their benefit from running the company that had failed. And then a third topic that we want to go over generally is the orderly liquidation fund. This is a fund for the FDIC to use to help in its resolution activities under Title II. The FDIC had suggested that this be pre-funded in the run-up to Dodd-Frank. That did not carry the day. So it is an ex-post fund. Treasury will have to raise money to provide to the FDIC. I think in dealing with GSIB or CCP failures, it's clear that temporary public funding could be very valuable, particularly in the short run. It's the FDIC's preference to try and have the failed company, to the extent it's in a bridge, raise its own funding. But in the short run, there is money available. It is not unlimited immediately. The FDIC is able to borrow 10% of the value of the assets on the most recent financial statements of the failed company, and shortly after that, but in any event, within 30 days, the FDIC can borrow based on the fair value of the assets available for repayment in the failed company. That's a fairly broad definition, but it does not include assets which are not part of the estate. The OLF calculation generally is intended that the FDIC get a fairly small amount initially, and when it gets to 10%, and then when it can make a showing of the assets that are available for repayment with the Treasury, get more. In our initial determination for CCP resolutions, it appears that because IM would be included in the 10% calculation and probably not, at least currently, in the 90%, the 10% and the 90% may be very similar numbers, meaning that there would be a fair limitation on the amount that could be borrowed for a CCP resolution. One of the tenets of Dodd-Frank, of course, is that there be no taxpayers' losses involved with these resolutions. So there are several ways that the Act ensures that. The first, which I just discussed, is there is a limited amount that the FDIC as a receiver can borrow from the Treasury. Second of all, in the priority scheme, the OLF is treated as DIP financing would be in bankruptcy and is repaid as a priority, making its repayment extremely likely. However, if all else fails, there's the requirement that the FDIC assess the GSIB industry, those companies that are designated under Title I, to be assessed by the FDIC and make payments back to ensure that the OLF is repaid in full.
So I'm going to talk. Is that better? I'm going to talk a little bit about international engagement, and I'll start out by just mentioning, I guess, that Chairman Gruberg on a couple of occasions has noted that we really have an ongoing process among key jurisdictions to work to develop relationships that really will serve to foster the basis for cooperation in the event of failure of a GSIB. And this really has been a major priority for the FDIC over the past couple of years. So we really think of international engagement to address obstacles to GSIB resolution in three primary ways: bilateral, multilateral, and institution-specific. So what does this mean? Our bilateral work includes our great involvement with the Single Resolution Board, or SRB, and that extends to the ECB, or European Central Bank. It also includes our close involvement and regular engagement with the UK, the European Banking Union member states, such as France and Germany, as well as Switzerland and Japan. The multilateral work includes our work with the Financial Stability Board, or FSB, which really is coordinating important work to develop guidance for banks, insurance companies, central counterparties, or CCPs, in the space of resolution planning. And as you can imagine, we're, of course, quite involved with those particular efforts. With respect to institution-specific efforts, the crisis management groups, or CMGs, are really pivotal to the communications among home authorities as well as key host authorities in terms of really drilling down into the resolution actions and building out the details of implementing a resolution plan and trying to avoid reflexive ring fencing. I'll say just one thing now regarding information sharing agreements, because I think we'll cover that a little bit more in segment 3. But I would like to discuss a joint process that we've developed with our colleagues at the Federal Reserve Board for outreach with respect to the Title I plans. And this is really to ensure that we're responsive to our colleagues at other agencies and are able to provide them with feedback and analysis on the plans themselves, as well as facilitating access to the plans where the agencies have a bona fide interest in a particular firm and are either a home or a host authority. Just to give a few examples on the bilateral side, earlier this year we participated in a number of exercises, including a tabletop hosted by the authorities in Switzerland as well as one in Germany. With our European counterparts, we have both formal and informal working groups with the European Commission and the Single Resolution Board, or SRB, and this really includes engagement at all levels of the organization, including staff secondments. Turning to the UK, which of course is very important to the US in the sense that all of our if you look at our GSIBs, you know, the majority of their assets outside the US are held in the UK. The FDIC has really built upon the efforts of our principal level exercise that we conducted in late 2014 with principals in all the UK regulatory bodies as well as the US, and we really continue to work very closely with them, building on that effort with weekly and monthly calls to engage on a variety of cross-border resolution planning efforts. Excuse me. And then lastly, the FDIC hosted a bilateral exercise with authorities in Japan to discuss cross-border resolution issues, including funding and liquidity models, continuity of access to FMIs, the ISDA protocol, and some other key issues. In terms of multilateral outreach, I'll touch on just a couple of issues with which the FSB is involved. With respect to the maintenance of critical functions and resolution, there are a couple of work streams I'd like to mention. First, the FDIC is co-chair of the FSB's Cross-Border Crisis Management Group for Financial Market Infrastructures. And I believe it was Chairman Massad, I think, mentioned that earlier. This group is really doing very important work considering guidance with respect to the resolution of a CCP in the event of the material financial distress or failure of the CCP. Another work stream is considering the issue of continuity of access to financial market infrastructures. Specifically, this is concerned with issues related to maintaining access to the critical services of FMIs during the resolution of a GSIB itself to support the payment, clearing, and settlement activities of the GSIB. The FDIC also co-chairs the bail-in and execution work stream, which is considering issues related to valuation, securities issuance, and so forth, really getting into the details of how that process would work. And then finally, the internal TLAC working group is working to develop guidance based on the FSB term sheet that was issued late last year. Going on to institution-specific engagement, the crisis management groups, we have established CMGs for our 7 GSIBs and have identified the key host jurisdictions, which means we have CMGs for Bank of America, JPMC, Bank of New York Mellon, Citigroup, Goldman, Morgan Stanley, and State Street. And in addition to these GSIBs, we've also established a domestic CMG for Wells Fargo. Beyond the GSIBs, we've also established CMGs for the 2 global systemically important insurance companies, in this case AIG and Prudential. And then finally, we're evaluating CMGs, potentially 1 or more, for systemic cross-border central counterparties, and I think we'll probably talk about that in the next segment a little bit. And then just one last comment, I guess, with respect to CMGs in general. For the past couple of years, we've actually had the firms participate for a half day in the CMGs, and I think that's been a really positive development to that particular effort. And they generally send in staff to present on a few issues related to that are fairly topical that we're studying at that point, talking about GSIB resolution. And prior topics have included things like their global funding and liquidity plans, the global communication plans in resolution, and so forth. Bob, I think that's the end of our...
So before we go into the second presentation, we thought we would see if there are any questions from the members of the committee about the first presentation from the FDIC. I'll start with one question. The chairman had alluded, and Commissioner Bowen, about some of the interconnectedness, and obviously one of the elements of the relevance of a GSIB resolution to CCP resolution has to do with the critical services that these banks provide to CCPs, and I'd be interested in how the FDIC thinks about the impacts of a GSIB resolution in terms of the relationship to continuity of services to a CCP, custodian, settlement, or otherwise.
So from a legal standpoint, we're talking about a receiver that hasn't been created, and I couldn't make any commitments on their behalf. Obviously, these are systemic institutions by definition. That's why we're dealing in Title II. So I think there are some policy concerns that might need to be raised, and I would defer to Herb on those.
So, under our single point of entry strategy that the FDIC has put forward, the top tier holding company in one of these institutions would be placed into receivership, and the operating companies would be able to stay open and operate business as usual. The parent would be the debt equity at the parent level would be left behind in the receivership. So it would basically have a balance sheet consisting of its investments in debt and equity of its subsidiaries. And on the liability side, it would basically have zero. So it would be well capitalized at the parent. They'd be able to use that source of strength to convert existing debt from their subsidiaries into equity to recapitalize the subsidiaries. And that's the ideal situation. If a subsidiary is hopelessly insolvent, provides no value to the group, then we wouldn't be able to support it from the parent, because it wouldn't make any economic sense, and it would have to go into its own resolution regime. So one good thing about the U.S. GSIBs is that they do have fairly robust level of debt at the parents. The parents' holding companies are relatively clean. Hopefully over time they'll become cleaner with the Fed Reserve's proposed regs. So the single point of entry is feasible if losses are not beyond the loss absorbing capacity of the corporation.
Are there other questions? Oh, I see. Marcus.
So two questions. One is in terms of the Title I living will process. It's my understanding that there's a lot of emphasis there on making sure that the resolution planning process provides for adequate liquidity for the company as it goes into bankruptcy in order to maintain critical operations. Could you talk a little? Does that intersect at all with how a failing clearing member would a failing clearing member in bankruptcy be expected to have any capacity to provide liquidity still to a clearinghouse, or how is that planned for?
I mean, part of their liquidity planning is to estimate the amount of liquidity that they would need to keep their memberships in the financial market utilities going. So it's going to be hard to operate one of these institutions smoothly unless they have access to the markets, and the markets are going to require them to post their collateral and meet their margin calls. So in the plans, they are working with all the CCPs to figure out kind of their needs and figure that into their living wills and their liquidity calculations as to how much liquidity they would have to have at the time of failure. So definitely keeping the access to financial market utilities is a very important part of the living wills.
And that might actually prevent them from defaulting in some sense, at least to the clearinghouse.
Yeah, I mean, if their projections are right, they should have sufficient liquidity on hand to prevent them from defaulting.
And just a quick second question, in terms of the credit line in Title II, the Treasury liquidity line, what exactly is included as an asset of the CCP that could be loaned against? You mentioned IM.
So it's a fairly aggressive definition. It's basically assets that are owned by the institution. So assets that are held in trust would not be included, and to the extent assets were ring fenced by another jurisdiction, they wouldn't be included. But everything else that could be deemed an asset would be valued and would be included,
including clearing memberships.
Sure. I mean, we will have a valuation process, and I'm not exactly sure what they're worth or would be in that situation, but they would definitely be included.
Any other questions before we proceed to the next part of the discussion? Seeing none, why don't I turn it back to the panelists?
Great, thanks. And can we bring up the other presentation and go to slide 3? Great. While that's happening, so first of all, on behalf of DCR, my colleagues and my fellow presenters, we would like to thank Commissioner Bowen and her staff for inviting us to present, as well as Chairman Massad and Commissioner Giancarlo for their support of the important work of the Market Risk Advisory Committee. I'd like to thank the FDIC, Herb, Chuck, and Penn for the preceding presentation on GSIB resolution and their collaboration with us on the presentation we're about to go through on DCO resolution. And we also are very appreciative of the very collaborative and important work on CCP resolution that we're working on with the FDIC, both domestically and internationally. And finally, I'd also like to thank my colleague Bob Wasserman, as well as the staff of the DCR, Division of Clearing and Risk, and FDIC, who assisted in working on today's presentation, including Kirsten Robbins and Andre Goldsmith. Finally, if we could just go briefly to slide 2. That's 3. Yeah, just the disclaimer. The views expressed today are solely those of the presenters. I'm sure that goes for my FDIC colleagues as well. And the information is not necessarily the view of the agency or any departmental presentation. So if we could go to slide, perfect, thank you. CCP resolution is an important and timely topic, and I'm very pleased that we are having today's meeting and much of the dialogue today, and I look forward to the discussion from the members of this committee after the presentation. As was pointed out earlier, Chairman Massad referred to the 3 R's. But in addition to resolution, there's CCP resilience and recovery. We very much hope to never be in a position where we actually have to implement all the important coordination and planning that's being discussed today. CCP resilience has been and remains a core critical priority of the CFTC, as well as other regulators in the international community. That by in itself has been and could be the subject of many presentations, but obviously is not the subject for today. But we do note its importance, including the ongoing day-to-day work of risk surveillance and risk management done by the CCPs, as well as by the clearing members and by regulators, including our risk surveillance branch. There's important work being done around the world on margin methodology and stress testing at the CPMI, IOSCO, FSB, and other groups, and the focus on CCP resilience is critical. And again, as has been noted, the work on resolution, although there's an element of continuity, it's separate from, but bears an important relationship to the work on CCP recovery rules, CCP recovery plans, And I will note that CCP recovery rules and plans has been a major focus of our Division of Clearing and Risk and will be a major focus for the remainder of the year. And we expect to be providing some public guidance on recovery rules and recovery plans in the not too distant future that we hope will inform this debate. Turning now to the focus of today's presentation at the Market Risk Advisory Committee, the slide above, notice if we could stay with slide 3, so we'll be there for a few moments more. We'll go through, first of all, as a background, some of the international agreements regarding CCP resolution, including some important documents that were the key attributes published in 2011, the FMI Annex published in 2014. We'll also talk about international development of strategies, the U.S. statutory framework, some of the coordination we're doing together, and then we'll eventually go to some of the kind of current issues and challenges. But I do think it's important before we get into kind of today's issues that there be some focus on kind of the context and actually how much has already been agreed and how much important work has already been done in the topic of DCO or CCP resolution planning and strategies. And I think to really delve deeply into the challenging issues today requires an appreciation of that foundation. And I was searching as we were preparing for this presentation for an analogy to this, and at least the one I came up with was first year of law school in property class, and not to diminish the extreme importance of that, but we jumped in property class immediately into the most tricky edge situations, the law against perpetuities, life and being plus 21 years, and all the intricacies of what that meant. And we sort of jumped into that, but without really establishing, there's such a body of developed understanding, important work that's been done over the years. And so as we tackle the important challenges that remain, I think it's very important to understand the context around it so people realize we're not just starting from nowhere, but there's an enormous amount of work that's been done to get us to the point where we are. And I think that's one of the things I hope everybody will take away from that. So if we could go on to slide 4 briefly, key attributes. This was work that was done in the kind of primarily in the central banker and prudential regulator, focusing on financial institutions with, I think, a primary focus on banks. But then if we go to slide 5, there's a document, the FMI Annex, and we're going to be talking a lot about that in the beginning of today's presentation. I'm going to give a brief overview, and then I'm going to turn it over to my colleague Bob Wasserman to do a bit of a deeper dive into that. But that's a very, very important document for folks to read and understand, because it informs the core of what we all talk about. And so that is something, a document was published in October of 2014, actually by financial market infrastructures. It includes not just CCPs, but other types of infrastructures, such as trade or data repositories, among others. But there was a big focus on CCPs. The constituents who worked on that included international prudential regulators, such as the FDIC, central bankers, and market regulators. So it represented enormous effort. It was chaired by Paul Tucker, at the time was Deputy Governor of the Bank of England. And building on the key attributes, it was issued, it was designed as guidance for national authorities, yet also with cross-border cooperation and implications for a CCP resolution in mind. And among the many important high-level principles, goals, and objectives that were agreed in the FMI Annex included, what are the objectives of CCP resolution? What is the scope of the work of CCP resolution? What should the powers and authorities be for in the resolution and the resolution authority context? What are some of the principles around the considerations around the timing of entry into resolution? How should FMI contracts be treated in resolution? What sort of coordination and information sharing should there be among regulators? And what kind of resolution planning should take place at the authority and at the FMI level? So as some of the work that's being done today that will be discussed in further detail is delving into some of the strategies, some of the technical aspects, how we fine-tune some of those, how we reach agreement. It's very important for all of us to bear in mind that a lot of consensus and mutual understanding has been reached on these issues. And with that, I'll turn it over to my colleague, Bob Wasserman, to take us through the FMI Annex in more detail.
Thank you, Jeff. And so as Jeff was saying, there were quite a number of entities that worked together to come up with the FMI Annex. I should note that there was a great deal of coordination between the folks working on the FMI Annex and resolution and the CPMI IOSCO work on recovery that was published at the same time. And that, of course, is because, as Chairman Massad alluded to earlier, there is a really tight relationship between recovery and resolution. And I'll talk a little bit more about that as we talk about some of these highlights for the FMI Annex. And so the objectives set forth in that FMI Annex are financial stability, of course, which is always the key consideration, but as well, continuity of critical FMI functions, which is quite important to financial stability, and as well, avoiding exposing taxpayers to loss. And we'll talk a bit more about that later. And what the Annex establishes is that an effective resolution regime, this is what we're trying to accomplish, is one that achieves continuity and timely completion of critical payment clearing, settlement, and recording functions. And timely, of course, in the context of an FMI, and specifically a central counterparty, is a very demanding standard because essentially CCPs need to continue their functions every day. And so it requires a very high standard of planning and understanding in order to allow the CCP to do what it needs to do, which is to have continuous operation. And as well, timely settlement of obligations, and as well, continuous access of participants to collateral. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later. If you'd go to 7, please. Now, in terms of the timing of entry into resolution, I should note here that this is when a resolution authority should be able to put a CCP into resolution. And so this is not saying, and at this point, you must put an entity into resolution. Indeed, one of the basic tenets is that resolution is a discretionary decision. That is to say, it doesn't happen automatically. And of course, FDIC colleagues had explained the whole key turner process. And so what we have here is then when a authority should be able to put the entity into resolution. And speaking as well to some of the issues that Kim had raised earlier. And so one possibility is recovery measures are exhausted and have failed to return the FMI to both viability and continuing compliance with legal and regulatory requirements, or if they are not reasonably likely to be able to do that within the time frame required. Now, on the one hand, I should note that in order to get here, and this is alluding to some of the discussion we had at the end of the last panel, in order to get here, first, there would have had to be a failure of an entity with extraordinarily large exposures, almost certainly going to be one of those GSIBs. To the extent that, as was alluded to in the last panel, there would be a goal to keep the operating entities ongoing and to keep and to maintain their access to FMIs. Well, in order to maintain access to a central counterparty, you must timely complete all of your obligations, which means you will not have defaulted. And so, in other words, one requirement of our being here is that despite that planning, there was in fact a default. In other words, not only was there essentially a failure of one or more GSIBs, but the relevant recovery authorities, the relevant resolution authorities had decided either not to intervene or to intervene but not to follow the plan of maintaining continuous access. And so again, this sort of goes to that whole tail of the tail point. We're here because it's our duty to do that, to analyze this and to be sure that we cover all possibilities. But this goes to how unlikely some of these possibilities are. Moreover, remember that CCPs are subject to the PFMI, and certainly for member defaults must address comprehensively any potential credit loss. So in other words, the cover 2 that has been alluded to before, that is what is required in terms of pre-funded resources that the CCP is holding in its hands. But in addition, under the PFMI, the CCP is required to address comprehensively any potential credit loss. Now, that is going to be based on both pre-funded and committed resources, but yes, and we'll talk a bit more about this later, just as in the insolvency counterfactual, at the very, very end, one probably is looking at gains-based haircutting, otherwise known as variation margin haircutting. Let's go to 8, please. So the powers of the resolution authority, as was alluded to before, the resolution authority is going to step into the shoes of the entity. And so in other words, it would have the power to enforce unexhausted obligations of clearing members to make cash calls, as well as to either accept positions of the defaulting participant, if those powers are in fact in the rules of the CCP. Certainly the power to write down equity, gains-based haircutting, and tear-up. Let's go to 9. Now, I want to very clearly delineate the difference here between gains-based haircutting on the one hand and initial margin haircutting on the other. I know in many ways either way it's pain. And, pain is pain, to be sure. But I think both doctrinally, legally, there are some extraordinarily important differences. And so on the one hand, the annex says that engaging in VM haircutting must respect the rules of the FMI and the hierarchy of claims under the insolvency regime. The requirements for initial margin haircutting are more stringent yet. Only where initial margin is not insolvency remote, where it's consistent with the legal framework, and where it's consistent with the FMI rules. And I can speak with respect to the U.S. arrangements. Initial margin is remote from insolvency. Writing down initial margin is not consistent with the legal framework, and it's certainly not consistent with any of the rules of any of the DCOs. And so initial margin haircutting is quite simply in the U.S. off the table. I think that is true in a number of other jurisdictions as well, but I'm speaking specifically with respect to the U.S. I would note gains-based haircutting is in many ways the insolvency counterfactual. Obviously, it's important that there be limits there, and that's something as well that we are looking at in terms of things like recovery. Let's go to 10. The annex is aware or manifests an awareness of the systemic concerns around things like partial tear-up. And so in considering whether to do that, the resolution authority is directed to consider the impact on both risk management of the participants and financial stability. As was alluded to, I think, in the last panel with respect to banks, one very real possibility is to transfer the CCP to a bridge, or its functions to a bridge, going to 11. The annex as well encourages CMGs for FMIs that are systemically important in more than one jurisdiction. And I should note that there is presently a survey going on being conducted by CPMI IOSCO, and the results of which will be tabulated and turned over to the relevant FSB group, which is the FMI Cross-Border Crisis Management Group, to assess which jurisdictions consider which CCPs to be systemically important, and thus the tabulation will reveal things about where FMIs are systemically important in more than one jurisdiction, and as well the importance of recovery and resolution planning. And finally, and I know I'm running out of time, on 12, the annex talks about the importance of resolvability assessments, and as well the importance of making information available. And with that, I'm going to turn over to FDIC colleagues for 13.
Okay. I mean, you could certainly join in here, Bob. We're talking about the FMI CBCM as an FSB group that consists of members from all the G20 countries, and I think has 5 or 6 U.S. members, including Bob and myself. You know, we've done some basic work. We met here in Washington in December. We met in March in Amsterdam, and a couple weeks ago in London. Put together a long background paper, kind of setting out what the issues are with CCP resolution, and now are working on a discussion note that hopefully will be available for industry comment towards the end of the summer. Ultimately, there's a hope that there will be a longer guidance paper put out for comment at the end of the year on the various topics of interest of CCP resolution. Certainly, I think it's fair to say we're far from in total agreement within the group. Frankly, Bob and I agree on more things than a lot of my Foreign Resolution Authority colleagues do. So there's still much to be discussed, and I think it will be extremely helpful to get input from the industry at the end of the summer and then again at the end of the year. Anything you want to add, Bob? Is that all right? Okay. And let's move to the statutory framework for DCOs. Obviously, the primary insolvency regime for DCO is the bankruptcy code, in which case the FDIC would have no involvement, which would be grand. But my understanding is this is limited to only Chapter 7, actual liquidation and bankruptcy. So, and just to be clear, CCPs are not, even if designated under Title 8 of Dodd-Frank, they're not subject to the living will process of Title 1, the goal of which is to get large systemic financial companies to be resolvable under bankruptcy. That is not a goal for DCOs or CCPs in general. There are significant criteria that have to be met in order to do a Title II liquidation, one of which is that Title II would have a better result than bankruptcy. And I think given the current state of the bankruptcy law, that's a relatively low bar. We certainly believe that DCOs, FMUs in general, are subject to Title II. Only financial companies can be resolved under Title II, and whether your financial company is based on definitions supplied by the Federal Reserve, they're always their preference that we not say that anything would be subject to Title II until it actually is and a decision is made. But I think it's reasonable to say that the CCP's clearing activities are financial in nature. So assuming that Title II applies, you can see the 4 sub-bullets at the bottom. create a bridge, transfer assets, provide OLF funding, and enforce contracts, including the rule book. Sounds very similar to my discussion of the rules under Title II for GSIBs, and then, of course, the process would be exactly the same. Want to jump in?
Quickly, I will just note, as Penn alluded to, under Chapter 7, a DCO would be a commodity broker, and basically under the bankruptcy code, a commodity broker cannot enter Chapter 11 reorganization. It would have to go through a Chapter 7 liquidation, which means, of course, its ability to continue to provide its critical functions would end.
Thank you, Bob. And moving on to 15, I front ran this a little bit, talking about the resolution of a DCO. As I say, it would have to be determined at the time whether it was a financial company. We certainly believe that clearing activities are. And I think, frankly, this second bullet came from you, Bob. The notion is that there's a discussion of complying with some of the liquidation provisions of Chapter 7 of bankruptcy that relate to DCOs, and it's hard to imagine that even Congress would have put that in if they weren't contemplating DCOs being liquidated under Title II, the Order of Liquidation Authority. So that's the purpose of that, and I think it makes good sense. Thanks, Bob. And I'll defer to her.
Okay. The FDIC and CFTC have worked together extensively on resolution planning issues. And last year, we executed a memorandum of understanding on information sharing, and we've done a number of interagency exercises. Bob is a frequent visitor to our conference rooms, and we learned a lot from him in our planning exercises. And also, we've worked together with Bob on presentations to the FSOC, the Financial Stability Oversight Council.
Okay. If I could just add one thing, I think also, we really, as I mentioned at the outset, greatly appreciate the collaborative relationship we have. We have this kind of structure in the U.S. where the CFTC is the kind of authority with respect to recovery, and the FDIC is the resolution authority. Other jurisdictions don't necessarily have that structure. And fortunately, we've had a very collaborative relationship, both domestically as well as when we work with our international counterparts, and that is really a very important thing to have, because, recovery and resolution, the planning and kind of the rules and the CCP rulebook are a bit of a continuum, but it's something we greatly value and appreciate.
Indeed, and going to 17, and so as part of this planning that we've been discussing, SIDCOs as well, which is the systemically important DCOs, and as well those entities that have opted into that regime, have to maintain viable plans for recovery or orderly wind down. And as we've been discussing here, there is a very close relationship between the recovery plans and resolution planning, both in terms of avoiding, frankly, resolution, but as well in terms of having a full range of power of things that the FDIC could do if they had to step into the shoes of a CCP. And so part of that coordination that Jeff was referring to has been discussions around recovery planning and discussions around the recovery plans of the individual entities. In addition, we have a rule that says that the SIDCOs have to have procedures for providing both CFTC and FDIC with information that may be necessary for that planning. And indeed, the DCOs have been engaging in a great deal of stakeholder consultation concerning the development of recovery plans. And I know that's been a very fascinating set of discussions because, of course, considering what might happen in these sort of tail of the tail of the tail events is it's not fun. And but I think it's been a very healthy process, and I think a lot of progress has been made. Thanks. Then going to 18. And so, as we've been saying, there is a important relationship between recovery and resolution. There is a clear boundary, though. So as we've been discussing, resolution happens when and if, at least in the case of DCOs in the U.S., when and if the keys are turned. And so there is, in fact, a clear boundary. During recovery, the CCP remains in control. Once those keys are turned, the FDIC would be stepping in. And so that is, I think, a very important and clear boundary so that you know where you are.
So with regard to timing, this is an issue that we've given a lot of discussion to with our FSB group. Kim, I think you set it up well. The goal is not to go in too early. In the unlikely event that this ever happened, I, of course, wouldn't be able to prove that we didn't go in too early because once we're in, we're in. And otherwise, that's just the counterfactual. But there's no question that I think for all resolution authorities, the best resolution is the one that doesn't happen. And even if you look at some of the proposals around the world, say, reserving the last cash call for the resolution authority, that's only a presumptive notion. And I think in all circumstances, if the resolution authority took a look and saw, well, there's one more cash call left, I could really use that in resolution. If the view was that cash call would restore the CCP to viability, I think in all cases that would be allowed to happen in recovery, and there would be no resolution. So I think it's particularly important for resolution regimes that don't provide temporary public financing. There's going to be more need to go in and have cash calls available. As we've discussed under Title II, there is the ability to provide OLF on a temporary basis and should give us more flexibility in timing. So we're looking at the FDIC for as much flexibility as possible. Obviously, to avoid resolution if necessary. On the other hand, if it's clear at any point that either recovery won't work or that the recovery is leading to a lack of financial stability, the resolution authority will need the ability to go in earlier in the waterfall, and that's kind of the way we're looking at it now.
So we've talked a lot, including in the very first session, about incentives. And one thing is quite critical here, which is that in developing resolution strategies, and as we've discussed, that's a lot of the work that's going on right now, both domestically and internationally. It's important to be sure that the strategy, you want the strategies to be effective, but you also want to be careful of the incentives that you set. And certainly what you don't want to do is set a resolution strategy which incentivizes clearing members to say, well, maybe I'm not going to participate actively in that auction, because if I don't, maybe that would bring this thing into resolution, and I might have some advantages from that. And so these are calculations that need to be made in undertaking and in developing the resolution strategies, which affects a lot of what we're discussing here.
Okay. So I have not been asked to talk about incentives, but I did want to make the point that no one wants an incentive for clearing members to go into resolution, but there's several ways to deal with that. Obviously, getting rid of the incentive is one way, but providing incentives to stay in recovery would counterbalance that. And then, of course, providing incentives to avoid resolution would also be a factor. So just briefly on that, I want to talk a little bit about the differences between DCOs and banks as far as resolution planning is concerned. I mentioned earlier the living will process is not applicable to DCOs. But the recovery process in which the CFTC and the SEC have been engaging in, I think will be very helpful to the FDIC and its resolution planning. The first issue, of course, is understanding the company. And we've had the benefit of working with the CFTC. We are actually mentioned in their recovery plan rules, which we greatly appreciate. It's if I go off topic for a second, it's kind of ironic that pursuant to the statute entitled 2, there's really no legal reason for having the CFTC involved in a DCO resolution. But I think, at the FDIC, we would realize that we were fools if we did not partner with them every step of the way in the resolution. And, we're very fortunate to have a good working relationship now to help us build resolution plans. So we would have an idea of where to start if this ever came about. So the resolution planning is a little different, but I think the result will be the same. But, obviously the big difference between DCOs and banks in resolution planning is the loss absorbing capacity. Banks, by their nature, bank holding companies issue a lot of long-term debt, are required to have TLAC now, and where the losses fall is much clearer in the banking industry. From a resolution perspective, it would certainly be better that DCOs had more loss absorbing capacity. Obviously, the impact on business as usual clearing costs are a factor there. So I think those are the primary differences.
Although, again, one would note that while it isn't called TLAC, in fact, CCPs do have some very significant loss absorbing capacity. Specifically, the Cover 2 pre-funded part of the guarantee fund is a very important part of loss absorbing capacity, as are cash calls. And indeed, to the extent one looks at it as a subordination, the gains-based haircutting is as well loss-absorbing capacity. And so there is, I've sometimes been of the view, especially when we look at things like the pre-funded guarantee fund, that actually TLAC is actually something that almost started with CCPs, because that kind of mutualized default resource is something that we've had, for many, many decades.
Yeah, just to add to that, in some ways you can look at a CCP as 100% TLAC. It's there completely to provide loss absorbing capacity and mutualization. And there is another consideration present with regard to CCPs where it's a bit different from a bank, and that their fundamental characteristic is that the CCP there is risk in a CCP. Its job is managing risk as opposed to taking on risk because it has directional positions. And to be balanced against the question of kind of how much loss absorbing capacity should there be in a CCP and who should provide it, there's a kind of a moral hazard issue where those who are introducing the risk, it needs to be looked at that they are the ones who are bearing the risk of loss. And if an entity that's not the one introducing the risk is the one that's going to be the one that absorbs the losses, then you have to look at what incentives that creates for the parties that are taking the risk in the market, which are a bit different from the CCP.
But, Bob, just to be clear, I was talking about loss-absorbing capacity in resolution, and to the extent you use a cash call in recovery, that's not loss-absorbing for a resolution. Obviously, if it's retained for the resolution authority, that does add resources.
Just want to reemphasize something we discussed before, which is that the importance of continuity of critical functions, and given the time scale that DCOs and other CCPs operate under, which is to say needing to operate literally every business day, that emphasizes the need for the very excellent cooperation that we've had between ourselves and our FDIC colleagues, because it is critical that you're almost basically taking the controls while the plane's still in the air. And happily, there's been, as I think we've demonstrated here today, significant cooperation, coordination to allow that to happen if ever, heaven forfend, we needed to.
So I guess I'll end on the congratulating ourselves on our regulatory cooperation. I mean, it's very important for the FDIC, both in planning for the failure of a DCO and in our planning for the failure of a GSIB itself, because continuity of services from the DCOs is vital to make sure that they will continue in resolution for a GSIB, and then working on the failure of a CCP, which is is very difficult and a little earlier stage than we are on for the bank resolutions. And on information sharing, the recovery plans that the DCOs are preparing now act as really our window into the operations of the companies, just like the living wills do on the banks.
It seems that this would be an opportunity for members of the committee to ask the questions, and I see we have one down here.
Two questions, one sort of bureaucratic. Is the team in FDIC that is working on the DCO resolution process the same that is looking at how an FCM would be treated in a bank resolution process? And the more general question is just to get very precise about whether FDIC has a view on this. Would it be expected that a bank going down would have ported its FCM customers prior to it reaching the resolution phase? Or is it envisioned that that would happen in resolution? Obviously, the timing of examples of FCM problems have never reached to the scale of a systemically important bank. And if the answer is you haven't, that's fine. I'm just curious.
So all resolution planning would be under my section. So we do both the banks and the DCOs. Whether the clients would be ported prior to resolution or after, I think would depend on the circumstances. You know, if you have a GSIB that's in trouble and kind of slowly deteriorates, then they may be selling off valuable parts of the company in order to raise capital and reduce their asset size. If things happen very quickly, that's probably not going to be able to happen, and we'll have to deal with the customers in resolution.
I guess I would note, though, to the extent that the FDIC comes in with the single point of entry at the top and keeps the FCM operating, then it seems to me there would not be, again, there would not be an FCM failure, and thus not necessarily a need to transfer anyone, assuming, again, the decision is to keep the FCM operating. If the FCM were to be subject, on the other hand, to liquidation, then under Title II, the relevant provisions, of Subchapter 4, the commodity broker provisions, would be applicable.
Well, and of course, the possibility that companies that are subsidiaries of company in receivership would self-liquidate is fairly great. But I would think there would be less benefit to assuming that portability had already taken place for our planning purposes. If it has, I think that's great, but I think we'd want to plan.
What do the living wills suggest if that's public? Do they, because they must address that in terms of the approach that the banks will take.
In general, they talk about solvent wind down in bankruptcy for their broker dealers and FCMs. So they basically are thinking that customers are going to want to move their accounts and that they're not going to be engaged in new business. So it's a matter of how quickly can they either sell the customer base or arrange to have the customers ported to another institution.
Kim?
Thank you, gentlemen, for your discussion today. I was glad to hear, actually, anytime a regulator or a potential resolution authority acknowledges that it's important for a resolution not to preempt recovery, and it's also important for resolution not to create incentives that undermine recovery. I think those are good statements to hear. I do have a question and a concern about, I guess, your key process. It looks like in Title II, there was a provision made for the entities that are subject to Title II to have the primary supervisor of those entities participate in the decision about putting those entities into resolution. And so the SEC is there if it's a broker-dealer, the insurance authorities are there if it's an insurance company, and the Federal Reserve is there if it's a bank. But if this process were intended to apply to CCPs, it seems that there's a very important branch of that chart that includes the CFTC that is missing. And I have a concern about that on a couple of levels. One is that it amounts to resolution without representation, which is, a little bit un-American. But I also find that it is resolution that's lacking kind of the balance of power that would come from the primary supervisor's view and the potential resolution authority's view. And it seems that in the other cases there needs to be agreement, and it seems that that protection is missing in this case, which leads me to wonder if Congress actually intended this process to apply to CCPs, why the protection isn't there.
So there are so many things that I've been led to wonder about since I started reading Dodd-Frank. Our analysis of the statute is a little different, and I would make one correction. You said the Fed was there because of bank holding companies. The Fed's there because they're the Fed. They're always there. So, and we think that's just great. But our analysis is that in the insurance industry and the broker-dealer industry, there are different resolution regimes. The state resolution for insurance companies and SIPC. And for those reasons, the primary federal regulator was brought in. There are, well, first of all, you don't have to be designated under Title I to be subject to Title II. If a systemic asset manager were to fail this Friday, they would be put into Title II, and the SEC would not be involved. So I don't think it's a question of having the primary federal regulator there. It has to do with the insolvency regimes. But as I said, I don't think the FDIC could be more dedicated to working with the CFTC if it were, specifically in the statute. Clearly, they need to be involved. At the end of the day, it's a decision about financial stability. So the condition of the CCP is a factor, but there are others. I don't think Congress intended to exclude CCPs because the CFTC was not a key term.
Richard.
Yeah. Yes, Robert. I had more or less a question that was similar to Kim's about the authority issue, because I've noted academic literature that has argued that resolution authority does not apply to DCOs, and I'm wondering if Robert, you're doing anything to counter that argument in the atmospherics?
So I have noted some academic literature myself. I've even noted academic literature that says that bankruptcy code does not apply to DCOs. First Amendment is very strong, and folks are free to say whatever they want, however misguided it might be. And so I would note, just again for the record, that it is very clear that the bankruptcy code applies to DCOs, that they fit very clearly within that statutory framework. Similarly, with respect to Title II, and we did not burden this group with a point-by-point analysis of how you get there, but basically the activities that DCOs and other CCPs undertake are in fact financial in nature and fit within the various regulations that the Fed under 4K and the FDIC under basically Title II and somewhat mimicking 4K did as financial in nature. And again, for those who say, well, wait a minute, though, there's nothing in Title II that explicitly mentions DCO, so how could they be meant, or even with a structural argument, as Kim was referring to. But as Penn noted before, when you look, and this time we did get straight down to the subsection level, 210M mentions member property under subchapter 4 of Chapter 7. Member property is solely relevant to a DCO, which is a commodity broker. And so, in fact, there is, I think, a very clear congressional intent that DCOs are, in fact, eligible under Title II, else they would not have mentioned member property, which doesn't apply to anyone else in the world.
Thank you. Let me turn the discussion back to Petal.
In keeping with our agenda, I'd like to thank Robert Steigerwald for leading the last two panels, and I'll turn to Commissioner Bowen for closing remarks.
This was a great discussion, and I really do want to thank the guest panelists today, particularly the members from the FDIC for coming today. It's a tough topic, resolution. Hopefully we won't need it, but it's best for us to plan for it in any event. But Susan, thank you. I know Tom just left. Want to thank Tom and the subcommittee for all your work. And I'm not sure if the chairman wants to say anything. Okay. With that, everyone travel safely, and thank you so much again.
The meeting is adjourned. MRAC members, you do have some paperwork, so if you can submit those to me if you have it, that would be great. Thank you.
Yes.